This morning, Tribunal Number 1 has convened in order to hear statements by the defendants in person. The defendants sitting in the first row will make their statements, those who desire to do so, from their places.
Ist mein Herzen die Liebe zum Menschen. Und so trage ich sie von meinem Gewissen. Als ich in jener Zeit mit Pastor Bodeschwin, dem einzigen ernsthaften Warner, der mir persönlich bekannt wurde und begegnete, sprach, da schien es zuerst, wie wenn unsere Gedanken weit voneinander stünden. Aber je länger wir sprachen, und je offener wir dabei wurden, umso näher und enger wurde unser gegenseitiges Verstehen. Es war damals danach mit schwerem Herzen Mensch und als Arzt.
Following the unification of Germany by Otto von Bismarck in 1871 and the establishment of a protectionist system of political economy, the German nation flourished. The nation was in the midst of the birth of a new cultural renaissance and a revival of what became known as German classicism, first introduced in the middle of the 18th century by Moses Mendelssohn, Lessing, Schiller, and others, and continued to the end of the 19th century. German society moved away from outdated oligarchical thinking to get away from the idea of a caste system, of the inferiority of human individuals, and of the idea that a human being was nothing but an animal, who could be used for mere labor or for some other menial value. Instead, the promotion of freedom, as defined by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, through the development of creativity in an individual human being whose life was invaluable to the nation, to humanity, and to history, became the new governing principle of society. And through it, Germany became a cultural and political mecca, leading breakthroughs in science and industry and the development of the classical arts. Russians, Poles, Jews came in from all across Eastern and Western Europe to make this new nation their home, to live for the improvement and immortality of Germany. With the 1890 ousting of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, however, the British Empire unleashed a process which ushered in World War I, setting nation against nation and halting the cultural and industrial development of Germany. The end of the war crippled the young nation. Soldiers came back to find their family and friends separated and their country in ruins. The Versailles Treaty stripped Germany of its raw materials, its industry was dismantled and shipped off, and the heavy reparations it was forced to pay ignited the infamous 1923 Weimar hyperinflation. Meanwhile, the culture degenerated, and a new movement, eugenics, once ignored and attacked, received new prominence. Eugenics was a term first coined by Francis Galton in 1883 to denote the principle of strengthening a biological group on the basis of ostensible hereditary worth. Social Darwinists and leaders of the movement insisted that a new criterion for value had to be established. With the popularization of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species and Gregor Mendel's program of genetics, race, survival of the fittest, the strength of one's genes became the new criterion for value, so that the purpose of the state was no longer in guaranteeing and defending the individual rights of the citizens in the nation, but to serve the race. However, the doctrine was not nearly as new as some may have believed, but was as old as perhaps even humanity itself. And the axioms underlying this philosophy pivoted on the question, What is the value of a human being? The system of imperialism, which had dominated the world for the past 3,000 years and more, denied value in humanity, denied the existence of a creative spark within the individual human being, and seek to suppress the creative powers of the individual, and to subjugate the masses to the level of mere beasts. This system, introduced by the British Empire of that day, took hold of Germany. By the 1930s, chaos gripped Germany's political system, with radical political groupings such as the KPD and NSDAP orchestrating waves of strikes among industrial workers and farmers, and with political factions holding pitched battle in the streets over local issues. In 1932 alone, the Reichstag government was dissolved and elections called 5 times. The environment was ripe for an overthrow of the Weimar Republic. In 1933, Hitler came into power and adopted the political policy of eugenics. For the so-called greater good of the nation, he vowed to purge society of lives unworthy of life. But before the end of the decade, grave sacrifices would be made for his so-called greater good.
And who could imagine, in a country of Goethe, of Schiller, of Wagner even, great musician, who knew he was an anti-Semite, of Brahms, that they would kill people by the numbers? Who imagined that? Incredible. And then gradually things started happening.
On June 22, 1933, Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of the Interior, introduced the early sterilization law into Germany, the first step in Hitler's lives unworthy of life policy, declaring that Germany was in grave danger of Volksstaat, or death of the nation, and that harsh measures needed to be taken. 3 weeks later, the doctrine of basic sterilization was implemented, and hereditary health courts were set up to oversee the mass sterilization of those with mental deficiency, schizophrenia, manic depressiveness, epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness and deafness, body malformation, and hereditary alcoholism. With the nation's economy in shutdown, and with the nation now beginning to mobilize for war, the prime concern for further measures in Hitler's program became that of cost-effectiveness and value. Germany needed a health program which would not only enforce racial and hereditary fitness, but which would also contribute significantly to the war mission and help cut down the costs of the state. In an August 1933 speech at the opening ceremony for a state medical academy in Munich, the Bavarian Commissioner of Health, Professor Walter Schultz, declared that sterilization was insufficient. Psychopaths, the mentally retarded, and other inferior persons must be isolated and killed.
Nur ein gesundes und starkes Volk wird leben und Werte schaffen zum Segen der Nation und zum Segen der Welt.
From 1934 on, hospitals were encouraged to neglect patients and allow them to die. Meanwhile, Hitler's propaganda machines turned out statements, posters, and educational materials pushing the idea of mercy deaths for the benefit of society. For example, questionnaires in school textbooks asked such questions as what the cost-effectiveness was of saving the life of a mentally handicapped person versus a healthy citizen. One mathematics textbook asked the student to calculate how many government loans to newly married couples could be granted for the amount of money it cost the state to care for the crippled, the criminal, and the insane. Demonstrations were held, movies were made, such as the Karl Brandt-inspired film I Accuse, developed specifically for the purpose of persuading the populace to accept the idea of euthanasia, and which depicted a scene of a terminally ill wife pleading with her husband and the doctor to give her an injection and relieve her terrible pain and suffering. The needs of individual patients and citizens soon became secondary. The needs of the German state became the accepted basis for the behavior of Germany's medical doctors. By 1938, a program of child euthanasia was soon underway, beginning with the abortion and death of mentally or physically deformed infants. The Nazi administration, of course, was keen to move even further. Hitler knew that in time of peace, it would be impossible to implement the full extent of his euthanasia program. He needed a crisis to do it, and war was the perfect excuse. On September 1st, 1939, the day of Hitler's invasion of Poland, a statement was issued to physician Karl Brandt.
Reichsleiter Buller and Dr. Brandt MD are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the authority of certain physicians to be designated by name in such a manner that persons who, according to human judgment, are incurable can, upon a most careful diagnosis of their condition of sickness, be accorded a mercy death. Signed, Adolf Hitler.
An organization was set up to expand the program of child euthanasia to that of euthanasia at all ages and all walks of life. Kraft durch Freude, literally meaning strength through joy, which began as the Third Reich's leisure promotion organization, was called in to serve the more sinister purpose of euthanasia. The offices of the organization were expanded and moved from the cramped streets of Wolfstrasse to a new central office in a confiscated Jewish villa in number 4 on Tiergartenstrasse. The operation soon came to be known as T-4. T-4 operated through the establishment of a special committee of 3 to 4 psychiatric experts. The Reich Health Ministry drafted a series of questionnaires which they sent out to medical hospitals and other institutions. The Meldebogen 1 questionnaire was to be filled out for individual patients by the physician himself, asking for details about patients' birth, elements of family history, especially concerning hereditary illness and such things as excessive use of alcohol, nicotine, or drugs. An evaluation of the patient's condition, indicating possibilities for improvement. Life expectancy, prior institutional observation, and details of physical and mental development, especially details pertaining to the patient's ability to labor. Each institution also received a one-page questionnaire known as Meldebogen 2, requesting specific information about the institution itself, including the size of the property, the number of buildings, the number of staff and patients, the number of patients committed for criminal offenses, the number of Jewish patients, and the exact location with distance to transportation networks. This questionnaire was designed to help T4 decide how to utilize the institution concerned in the killing operation. From it, T4 managers could learn the number of patients involved, the legal status of the patient population, and the difficulties transportation might pose. The questionnaires were then sent to the Reich Committee panels of 4 experts who evaluated them. There were 3 boxes available for each questionnaire. The experts would put a blue dash, which meant the patient would live, or a red line, which meant the patient would die, or a 3rd box for undecided. The questionnaires were then sent to a chief expert who had the final say in the life or death of the patients. In a testimony after the war, the manager of the T4 program, Victor Brack, was to say,
"We welcomed it because it was based on the ethical principle of sympathy and had humane considerations in its favor. I admit that there were imperfections in the execution, but that does not change the decency of the original idea, as Böhler and Brandt and I understood it."
The state organism is as a whole with its own laws and rights, much like one self-contained human organism, which, in the interest of the welfare of the whole, also as we doctors know, abandons and rejects parts or particles that have become worthless or dangerous.
Before the surrender of German forces in 1945 and the suicide of Adolf Hitler in April of that year, over 5.9 million Jews would be murdered. Over 5 million ethnic Poles, Romanians, and Soviets were killed, and hundreds of thousands of mentally disabled, crippled, and senile were euthanized. It was precisely the Tiergarten 4 program of euthanasia which had set the precedent for the later mass killings and genocide in the concentration camps. It was precisely this program, for which people were convicted and hung at Nuremberg for. It was this program for which people today say never again.
Vor der Barackung das Dorf steht eine Hütte um den Hof, und die meerestraurigen Hütten draußen schlug die Freiheit verließen. Adieu zu dessen Land.
Now we in the United States are on the verge of implementing that very same policy, that very same program of Tiergarten 4, which the Nuremberg trials condemned. Only this time the consequences will be much worse. In the midst of an existential crisis of all humanity, with the entire economic and monetary system of the planet collapsing, U.S. President Barack Obama is pushing a health reform bill which is an exact replica of Adolf Hitler's T-4 policy, and which would take healthcare entirely out of the hands of the physicians and patients, and would concentrate the power to choose who lives and who dies in a small committee of 5 people, with one chief executive making the final decision. Sound familiar? This legislation is justified under the doctrine of cost-effectiveness. That is, reasoning whether your life is worth it to maintain. According to the legislation and according to the writings and the speeches of Obama's advisors, such as Rahm Emanuel and Ezekiel Emanuel and others, if you are over 65, if you're disabled, if you have a terminal or a degenerative illness, even if you suffer from dementia, you should be euthanized because you have no value as a creative individual, and the cost of keeping you alive by far exceeds your benefit for society. But are one's physical traits what give one value? Is money what gives one value? Is it how well one can labor or how well one can speak? Before we implement a policy which was denounced at Nuremberg as a crime against humanity, let's answer first, what is the value of a human being? Schiller, in his aesthetical essay on magnitude, describes the feeling of powerlessness, of smallness that comes when one looks up at the sky and sees the never-ending heavens, the infinite star-studded celestial sky. How small am I? How little and insignificant am I as an individual human being, humanity, compared to the vastness of all this? But, Schiller asks,
is it an external force which gives him this experience of his limitations? Is it the fault of the measureless ocean or the infinite star-sown heaven that I become self-conscious of my impotence while representing their greatness? Whence, in that event, do I know that their greatness exceeds the reach of my representation, and that I can obtain no totality of their image? Do I indeed know of these objects that they are supposed to constitute a totality of a mental image? I could only know this by virtue of my mental image of them, and in no other way, and yet it is presupposed that I cannot imagine them as a totality. They are thus not presented to me as a totality, and I myself am the very one who first put the concept of totality into them. I thus already have this idea in me, and I myself, the thinking being, am the very one by which I, the being which makes representations of images of the intellect, am vanquished. In contemplating these great objects, I indeed experience my powerlessness, but I experience it through my strength. I am not vanquished by nature. I am vanquished by my own self.